Hi, we continue today with our introductory overview of the Abraham and Sarah story from Genesis 12 to 24. Last video, we looked at the influence of stories from outside the book of Genesis on our presuppositions about the character of Abraham, first Abram, of course, and now we're going to look at aspects of how this story is presented from within the book of Genesis. And one of the first things we have to consider if we've been following Genesis through the first 11 chapters is suddenly we have characters who we meet for more than one episode. Noah took up 3 or 4 chapters, but really there's only 2 episodes. There's the flood, and then there's a little aftermath with the curse of Canaan and Ham. But other than that, none of the characters have more than one episode, really. Adam and Eve are in the garden, and briefly we see them outside, but there's really not much of a sequential characterization or life story that we see in any of them. But now we're going to have these famous characters for 12 chapters. And given the biblical economy of how words are used, 12 chapters is a long stretch, as much as the entire book so far. So if you think about that, we've seen the initial creation, the Garden of Eden story, Cain and Abel, the flood, the Tower of Babel, and all the little pieces in between. And now we're going to have 2 characters and people around them that take up as much space, a quarter of the entire book of Genesis. So that leads us to take even deeper account of what we've been looking at from the very beginning, which is the question of sources and how these pieces fit together. And I'm not going to go into all kinds of details about the history of scholarship around this, which could take us far afield and take a long time. But it is important as we enter into these chapters to ask ourselves, in light of Joel Rosenberg's work, and you can see his name and a diagram that I adapted from his book that you see listed there on the right side of the screen, who asks whether this is a cycle or a story. And what he's saying in that is, a cycle is what scholars have traditionally seen as a collection of stories about a given set of people, but from different sources, where none of the individual sources intended the entire collection as we now have it to be what readers are encountering. For example, in chapter 12, right after Abram's call, we find that he will tell Sarah to lie about who she is to Pharaoh in Egypt to protect him. And in 8 chapters later, in chapter 20, we'll see a very similar story. And one of the initial questions we have to look at is this the same story told from 2 different perspectives, which is to say, is there simply one event, but the tradition has carried 2 versions of it? Or do we read this as we normally read literary work as, well, they're doing it again. It's a second time, and that allows us to draw inferences about characterization and plot from the repetition of an episode in a little different context. And there are a number of examples like that. So Rosenberg's chart that you can see on the right side that I've color-coded from his book is doing as best he can to say, however these stories came to be in the first place, somebody has taken them and put them into this context where they more or less fit together into a story, into a continuous story, but not completely. And in his book, he discusses how the challenges of someone trying to keep all the material that was not designed to fit into a pattern like this and arrange it that way without breaking it up into pieces that artificially. And of course, we can't know what those initial sources were because we have no evidence of them other than the inferences that scholars draw that some of the stories seem to be styled in different ways. And that's a tradition that we've been looking at in terms of the priestly author with his genealogies and attention to a transcendent God and to God's distance from human beings and the previously known Yahwist source, now known sort of prosaically and non-interestingly as non-P, who's got a more intimate sense of God and uses the name Yahweh to refer to God, hence the original German version of Yahwist with a J from the German for Yahweh, like in Jehovah with a J. And each of those sources had different perspectives, as indicated in their different understandings of God, their different understandings of people's relationship with each other and with God. We saw how whoever the editor has managed to sew those into an intimate and tightly woven fabric in the flood story, where we looked at the traditional scholarly separation into the J and P versions, and yet for 1,800 years until Wellhausen came along, most readers just read this flood story as a continuous narrative, not worrying about details that might be technically inconsistent with each other. So we don't have such a similar pattern here, although many Bibles will have footnotes that say this is a J story or this is a P story, etc. But given the shift in scholarship from the days of von Rad and others who were firmly committed to Wellhausen's view that the Yahwist author is from the time of Solomon in the 10th century and the priestly author is from the time of exile. Now I think it's fairer to see a number of scholars growing in a consensus, if not a total clarity, that much of this book, if not all of it, was written from the time of exile. And we'll see right away when we look at the first story in the Abram cycle here in chapter 1 that you can see on the left side of the screen, it makes perfect sense as being directed at people who are being called out of exile. Abram, of course, having started exactly in Babylon, and we'll look at maps and see how that works. So you don't have to make a decision on that now, and Rosenberg, writing 35 years ago, was writing at a time before that consensus had broken down, and people were seeing Genesis as not only J and P, but also E, an Elohist source, understood as the northern kingdom of Israel's version of the Yahweh stories after the Assyrian conquest in 722 broke up the unified sense of the nation of Israel and Judah and separated Israel for the rest of the time of the monarchy until the exile. Again, we don't have to get into that kind of detail. We will read this as a continuous narrative, but noting times where God is portrayed in the Yahwist sense and where God is portrayed more in the Elohist priestly sense as we go. So, as you can see, if we focus on the framework on the right side, I've color-coded to see the patterns, and the parts that are in brackets are the parts that are out of order of what would normally be called a chiasm. I didn't put chiasm here because he didn't use that term, and I'm trying to just reflect what he did here. All I did was to change the order of how he presented it and color-coded. Otherwise, it's directly from his work. And so you can see it starts and ends, as he presents it, with a genealogical framework that's sort of outside the immediate Abraham and Sarah story itself. And the migration from Haran begins it, and then a migration to Haran is near the very end. And the building of altars at both ends, the two wife-sister episodes that is referred to, two questions about border disputes or agreements, as we see here, two Sodom episodes, two covenants, and then curiously at the center is the expulsion and rescue of Hagar, and that leaves outside of it only two major stories: the second Hagar episode where she's sent out with Ishmael seemingly to die but is rescued, and the binding of Isaac where Abraham goes out with Isaac seemingly to die and is rescued. And so it's curious that both stories that are outside the pattern are very similar stories to each other but not fitting within this framework, otherwise juxtaposed right next to each other. And perhaps for that very reason that there's no way you could put the Hagar story near the beginning, since it requires all the story that's happened about Sarah and Hagar, etc., and the birth of Ishmael to take place before it. So we'll be using Rosenberg along the way, and another part of what he does, and I don't have a chart to show you this, but notice the title of his book, King and Kin, Political Allegory in the Hebrew Bible. One of his claims, again, breaking new ground then, now it's a lot more scholars have taken up the view, perhaps following Rosenberg directly or perhaps independently, that the stories in Genesis are not simply memories of Israel's ancestors, but are constructed stories to say something about the time of exile and the monarchy that came out of it. So in other words, just like the exilic books of the prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel are writing after the exile, at least Jeremiah is writing partly after the exile, to reflect on what went wrong, to give some kind of theological explanation and some hope for some future post-exilic existence, both in terms of a restored Jerusalem temple. Here, the book of Genesis is approaching the same question from a different angle. And what we'll see is it's suggesting, and we've already seen this in the Tower of Babel story and the other primeval history stories, that civilization is the problem, and that civilization begins with agriculture, and agriculture began in the garden with disobedience from God's command to eat freely from what God had provided, rather than taking control of the food supply directly. And so we'll see Abraham and Sarah struggle with cities, or at least empires, in the sense of Egypt in particular, but we'll also see smaller versions of that. And so rather than provide a prophetic view, or like the book of Leviticus does in the exilic context, an alternative form of organizing around a relationship between priestly rituals and personal piety and remembering the story, This is telling stories that don't have easy morals, that have characters doing things and experimenting with them and leaving readers to decide, is that really what Yahweh wants them to do? Or more directly, is that what Yahweh wants us to do in our context? And so for that reason, I think these stories are particularly relevant for us now, living in a time of climate change and many other struggles, to be asking some deep questions about whether our systems of social and economic power should be maintained because they can be redeemed to provide life and health and beauty and goodness for humans, for others, or need to be abandoned, as Abram is called to abandon Babylon and move out into a new way of being. So I hope you'll find that these stories, despite the great distance in time and culture from between them and us, speak to issues that remain important issues to us as these ordinary people develop their characters throughout. And let's also note, as a presupposition, I didn't name this last video, but it's really important to see, this is not a story about Jews or Israelites. These people are not what much later were labels put on their descendants. As I noted last time, the very name Israel comes from an angelic alternative to Abram's grandson Jacob's name, and so plainly one can't be an Israelite as the grandfather of the person who began that label. And similarly, the much later term Jews derived from things like Judahites and Judeans relating to the nation-state of Judah and its focus around Jerusalem, but especially the post-exilic period when people were detached from the land and had to have a label to refer to themselves, is a much, much later time. Not only later than the story world in the book of Genesis, but later than the exilic world by a long shot. So we won't hear these people referred to as Jews or Israelites. What they are, as we'll see, are Mesopotamians who have been called by the God that Israel calls God, Yahweh, to begin anew. And so as they do, there are a number of themes and plots that develop, as well as promises and responses, and that's what I want to look at in the rest of our video here. And why don't I just maximize this now so we can see this bigger, since this is our focus as we go. So for each of these themes in blue, we'll see a number of plot expressions, and I won't go over this in detail. I'll post it to the web page as I've been doing, but just to give us a broad idea as we start. So first theme, obedience to God's call to leave behind the familiar, land, family, home, to go where and to what God calls. And of course, that's the very first call right at the beginning of the story. But we'll see several other examples of that as we go, including Lot's call to leave Sodom, which he does not do in parallel to Abram's call to leave Ur. And that will be a character comparison we'll get to in detail at the time. Another one, Yahweh's promises of blessing and abundance are trustworthy, and I have a whole other chart that we'll look at in a moment for that. The relationship between divine and human initiatives, and isn't that a basic one for Genesis and for the New Testament and for all of life? What is the relationship between God's will and human will in shaping our lives and the lives of those around us? And so we'll see that around a number of issues, about finding food amidst famine, about food and water in a dry land, about children, about fulfillment of the promise of the land, and over the various questions of inheritance of God's promises, which is to say we'll have our first intergenerational story where the question is going to be not only for Abraham and Sarah, but for their descendants. How much do they have to learn everything from scratch, and how much can a tradition of wisdom be gathered that can be passed on to children? And of course, that's what the Bible is intended for, and a whole sense of a religion is a set of traditions that can be passed on so each generation doesn't have to figure it out for themselves. But on the other hand, you don't want a generation of robots who simply do as they're told without exercising the free will that God has put in us as part of the image of God that is built into us. So it's an inherent tension in human life, and Genesis struggles with it here. Another theme, the relationship between the people of the promise, still not with a specific name at this point, and of the covenant, and other peoples. And again, that's an important theme for the exilic people, because we see texts like Deuteronomy and Joshua coming not out of the exile, but just before that, whose view of the other people is to destroy them. Have no mercy on them, but destroy them completely, as you see in texts like Deuteronomy 7. In other words, they're like an infection that you can't live with. You must simply destroy it. But we'll see that the characters in this part of Genesis are not radical like that. They figure out ways to go around people, and there is violence, but limited, and it's not genocidal as Deuteronomy calls for. So countering that, offering another biblical expression of that. So let's look at the promises and themes, and then we'll actually actually, in the next video, enter into the story. So we see a whole series of these, and more of these in this section of Genesis than any other part of the Bible, where God offers an invitation, there's a promise if something happens if you accept the invitation, and there's the response. And so we've already hinted at this first one, the go from your country and your kindred and your father's house, and all the various aspects of this promise that, of course, we'll look at in detail when we get there. And Abram went. And as we'll discuss when we get there, if he didn't go, there'd be no rest of the story. But the fact that he did go is one of the most amazing things in the entire Bible. Now, again, we'll look at that in some detail. And so, after that, in the next chapter, raise your eyes and look from the place where you are, north, south, eastward, and west, for the land that I will give you to your offspring. And Abram moves his tent and continues to trust. And here, don't be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward will be great. And he trusted Yahweh in the very passage that Paul uses in Romans to construct his doctrine of justification by faith. One addressed to Hagar here, to return to her mistress and submit to her. These are not just all made to Abram or Abraham, as we're seeing. And so she listens, and she has an experience of God. I am God Almighty, walk before me, and I will make my covenant between you and make you numerous. And Abraham fell on his face, and as we'll see at the time, that's ambiguous of whether he fell on his face with respect and awe, or he fell on his face with laughter, the absurdity of it. The implied invitation here to enter into a covenant sealed by circumcision, and the description of it there, and then this time he definitely fell on his face and laughed at the impossible seeming situation of a child being born to a man who's 90 years old, or a woman who's 90 becoming pregnant. And yet they trust it, and it does happen, as Sarah's laughter also indicates there. Another one to Abram about his son Ishmael, to trust that he'll be okay despite the sending her off, and he sends her off, and Abraham does not find out that Ishmael's okay right there, but we do as readers, and eventually Ishmael and Isaac will come together to bury Abraham, their shared father, of course. And then the binding of Isaac, one of the most powerful ones there is, and no reward is offered for that one, just do it. And Abraham does it. And if the one in chapter 12 where he leaves us feeling in awe of his willingness to just leave everything and go because a voice in his head told him, this one may terrify us in a parallel way. And they're very parallel stories in an interesting way. And then finally, the aftermath of that, where there is a reward, but only after it's happened, he returns. And that's the end of his relationship with Sarah. And the next chapter will be a negotiation for a burial place for her. So those are the themes and promises as we begin to enter into this. And we'll start by going backward to the end of the genealogical framework, to Terah's being the father of Abram and his two brothers, and how that changes the Toledot of Shem that we proceeded with. And then we'll be into our story. See you then. Bye-bye.